We had been driving through the forest for about 20 minutes when my daughter started acting strange. Kylie was ordinarily a loud and active toddler, with so much energy that my wife and I usually had to drag ourselves along behind her. Yet now, in the shadow of the huge evergreens, she had fallen silent. "Everything okay back there?" I asked. No response. "You excited about visiting the park, honey? We might even see a bear." I tried again. Still nothing. Kylie was staring with absolute concentration at these shadows beneath the trees. "Kylie, honey." My wife Heather reached back and shook Kylie's knee. "There's a man in the woods," and Kylie said simply. "Well, of course there is, honey. It's a national park." I laughed, but Kylie just scowled and looked back out the window. I sighed. The sun was just starting to cast its golden beams through the misty woods, and if Kylie was in one of her moods, we had a very long day ahead of us. I spotted a graveled turnoff up the road, and it occurred to me that maybe Kylie was just grumpy from the long car ride. My wife and I were plenty sore ourselves, and the prospect of dipping our feet in a cool mountain stream was too good to miss. I pulled in beside a dusty pickup truck and flashed a mischievous grin at Heather. We were both out the door as soon as the wheels had stopped rolling. Kylie, however, refused to budge. "This is a bad place. I don't wanna." My daughter crossed her arms. There was no reasoning with her when she was like this. I nodded to my wife and we each grabbed an arm to lift her out of the car seat. Kylie wailed and clawed, putting up such a fight that I was grateful that I had trimmed her nails in the hotel room the night before. I looked over my shoulder at the pickup and winced. If the driver was around, he would probably think that Kylie was being kidnapped. "There's a creek down there with big rocks and fish and waterfalls," I cooed. "You're gonna love it, Kai." Suddenly, my daughter stopped crying, but it didn't have anything to do with my pep talk. "Okay, Daddy, let's go." Her arms had gone slack, her face blank. I had only ever seen her like this once before when our plane had hit a gut-dropping patch of turbulence, the kind that makes passengers wail, luggage fall, and lights flicker. But then as now, she had just shut down, too frightened to function. I couldn't imagine what was scaring her so badly. Apart from the rustling leaves and the murmur of the stream down below, the early morning forest was still. I slipped a neon pink jacket over Kylie's head before lifting her onto my shoulders and starting down the steep and muddy trail. Heather let out a loud whoop and sprinted past me. I winced. It felt wrong to disturb the silence. I thought and then wondered if Kylie's irrational fear had infected me as well. We found Heather lying on a smooth white stone beside the water, kicking her feet in the rapids. "It's so peaceful here." She smiled and I had to agree. Even Kylie seemed to be doing better. She sat at the edge of the rock, absent-mindedly tugging at clumps of moss. "You're pretty quiet, champ." Heather rustled our daughter's hair. "I'm listening to the man in the woods," Kylie replied with that same flat voice. A shiver ran up my spine. Most toddlers say creepy things from time to time, but Kylie had never gone this deep into her daydreams before. "What man in the woods?" "Honey, nobody's talking." "Yes, he is. I can hear him. He's talking inside my head." Heather and I traded a glance. "What's the man saying, champ?" Heather asked. Kylie just frowned and pulled away as if to say that whatever it was none of our business. The morning air suddenly seemed just a little bit cooler. A bird took off from a branch above us and Heather and I both jumped. But not Kylie. Our daughter was staring dead ahead at something on the other side of the creek. Before either of us could stop her, she got on all fours and scurried across these smooth river rocks. It's amazing how fast small children can move when they really want to. By the time that we got to our feet, Kylie was halfway across the creek. Not being a barefoot toddler myself, I slipped almost instantly, plunging into the freezing, waist-deep water. My daughter, meanwhile, had already reached the far bank. I felt a sudden, horrible certainty that if she climbed up it, we would never see her again. Fortunately, my wife was a lot less clumsy than I was. Jumping from rock to rock, she managed to grab the back of Kylie's pink jacket, seconds before she disappeared into the ferns. Ordinarily, Kylie screamed her head off whenever we stopped her from doing what she wanted. But now she was calm. In fact, she was giggling. Daddy got wet. Kylie, it is not okay to run off like that. What's gotten into you? My wife demanded. He said it would be funny. Our daughter replied with an all too adult sneer in her eyes. And he was right. Only then did it occur to me to climb the eroded bank and see what had made Kylie so eager to cross the stream. My fingers sank into the mud as I pulled myself upward, and then I fell back with a yelp as sharp teeth sank into my ankle. Kylie, Heather yelled. My daughter had bitten me. He doesn't like it when you look, Kylie hissed. That's enough, I grunted and picked my daughter up. She went into full tantrum mode, battering me with her tiny fists, but I was finally able to peer over the muddy creek bank. I saw only more trees, rotting logs, and a carpet of decaying leaves. Whatever Kylie had been so eager to get to, it was long gone. It was the worst fit that Kylie had thrown in years, maybe ever. Getting a flailing, screaming, biting child back across these slippery rocks was not an easy feat. By the end of it, all three of us were soaked and exhausted. I reached out for the car door and patted my hip for my keys. They weren't there. Had their clip come undone when I had fallen in the water, or had Kylie pulled them off on purpose? I didn't like to think about what that might mean. Now the keys, I groaned. I have to go back. Heather looked up at me from where she was struggling with Kylie. Her eyes begged me not to go. I understood how she felt. The day had suddenly turned strange and wrong, and all I wanted to do now was get back in the car with my family, drive out of the forest, and forget that any of it had ever happened. I glanced over at the pickup truck beside us. It was covered with dust and dead leaves, as though it had been sitting there abandoned for years. And what had happened to the driver? Something seemed to slither beneath the grimy blue tarp in the truck bed. I shuddered and turned back to my family. Kylie had finally calmed down. She sat in the gravel, messy hair hanging over her face, not saying a word. Babe, please, my wife whispered. Why don't we just go back to the road? We can flag someone down and ask them to call for help. Images flashed through my mind. Long, hungry hours waiting for some smug tow truck driver. Yet another bill from my already bloated credit card. Kylie crying nonstop, our vacation ruined. No, I couldn't let that happen. All I had to do was walk back down the trail and grab my keys. So why did that suddenly feel so hard to do? I took a last look around. The winding two-lane road should have been packed, but not a single car had passed by. I could feel my wife's eyes on the back of my neck pleading with me. Stay, they seemed to say. I'm scared. As much as I wanted to, somebody had to get us out of the woods. Shivering in my waterlogged jeans, I stuffed my hands into my pockets and trudged back down the trail. I found myself wishing that somebody else would appear, just to confirm that we were still inside the borders of the national park at all. A grimy backpacker, an old fisherman on his way to the creek, anybody other than Kylie's man in the woods. Although I kept my eyes down in search of the keys, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd look up and find them just in front of me, like the Green Knight from some childhood storybook, A mossy beard, a crown of antlers, golden animal eyes. A footstep crunched in the leaves to my left. Glancing up, I saw an enormous stag making its way through the trees. There was something unsettling about the way that it moved. It didn't look my way, didn't freeze when it saw me. It just kept walking straight ahead, like it was being guided by some terrible purpose. It was heading for the car. I jogged back up the slick path. The stag had reached the edge of the forest. Heather, oblivious, was squatting in the gravel trying to talk to Kylie. My daughter sat with eerie patience, staring straight ahead, like she knew the stag was coming. From my vantage point, I could see how it walked out from the tree line and knelt down in front of her, as though inviting her to ride it. I could hear my wife and daughter arguing. "Honey, get back here, that's a wild animal, you don't know what it might do." "The man in the woods say that I should go with it, Mommy. He says where I'm going there's lots of other kids just like me." Heather had heard enough. She grabbed for Kylie's arm, but the stag came between them. Snorting and frothing at the mouth, it reared back and rammed its head into my wife's chest. Heather flew backwards, impacting against the driver's side mirror with a sickening crack. She crumpled to the ground and lay still. Kylie, meanwhile, was already climbing onto the stag's back. "No!" I screamed. "Kylie, wait!" But the big animal was already moving. My daughter clung to the mangy fur of its neck. Her golden hair flashed in a beam of sunlight, and then she and the stag were gone, swallowed by these shadows of the forest. I ran to my wife. Heather was hurt but still breathing. I was trying desperately to remember my Cub Scout first aid when I heard tires crunching on the gravel. It was an ancient Park Service vehicle, and the woman behind the wheel looked just as grizzled as the car itself. She couldn't have been older than 30, but her sharp green eyes missed nothing. "Everything all right here, sir?" the ranger asked. Her hand was on the pistol at her hip as she stepped out of the vehicle. "My wife, she was attacked by a deer," I stammered. "And my daughter, she's missing." "Let me see your hands." I did as I was told. I realized that she was looking for blood or bruising on my knuckles, signs that I had been the one to slam my wife against the side of the car. "Okay," she grunted. "Step back." She bent down to inspect Heather. My wife let out a gasp as the ranger pressed on her right side. "Ribs broken," the ranger grunted. "Should probably get her to a doctor." "Now, what is this that I hear about a missing daughter?" I launched into my story, leaving out the harder-to-believe elements made sense at the time. I told the ranger that Kylie had simply run off into the woods after a deer. Only later would I realize what a terrible mistake that I had made. "Oh, time's a-wasting then," the ranger grunted. "Most lost kids are found within a couple of hours. The ones who aren't." She trailed off, bent low over some knobs and buttons in her cruiser, and then returned with a frown. "And we always get bad reception out here. Ma'am, are you gonna be alright to rest in the backseat of the cruiser while we look for your little girl?" My wife winced but nodded. The old-fashioned pack that the ranger extracted from her trunk looked bigger than she was, but she hitched it onto her back with ease. Her uniform too wasn't quite what it used to be, but the Forest Service brown color was familiar enough. "Well," she asked, "you coming or not?" In between shouts of Kylie's name, the ranger introduced herself as Maddie Corvin. "We'll do a quick search of the area, but after that I'm going in for backup," Ranger Corvin said. "Keep the cruiser in sight at all times. You might think you know where the road is, but trust me, it's easy to get turned around out here." I could see what she meant. No matter which way I was facing, the carpet of ferns and dead leaves looked the same. Enormous tree trunks rose up from it like columns in some ancient temple. And then I glimpsed something that made my breath catch in my throat. A hot pink jacket. Ranger Corvin was yelling after me, but I only had thoughts for that sad little jacket laying in the mud. I ran to it and flipped it over. A pale, lifeless face stared up at me. Its eyes were hollow pits, its mouth a crimson smile sliced from ear to ear. A strangled cry escaped my lips, and it took me a long moment to realize that I was looking at some sort of doll. Its head was made of an empty hornet's nest, its grin painted on with what looked like berry juice. Who would make something like this? A bony hand squeezed my shoulder and I jumped. Maddie Corvin glared down at me. "I warned you not to run off on your own," she spat. I didn't understand why she was so angry until I had looked around. I could no longer see the parking lot or the trail, and I had no clue how to get back, and from the expression of Ranger Corvin's face, neither did she. She took out a compass and we both waited while the needle spun, and spun, and spun. Ranger Corvin took a deep breath, the kind you take when you're trying to get your fear under control. She replaced the compass on the side of her pack, extracted some reflective tape from a side pocket, and then wrapped a strip of it around a nearby tree. Looks like old Higgs wasn't completely full of shit after all," she muttered. "Huh?" I asked. "Oh, Bert Higgs, my predecessor. He used to say that all sorts of strange stuff happened on this side of the park." "What did he say?" "I don't know, never paid him much attention. I always figured that he was messing with me, 'cause he didn't like women in the service. I joined up in '73 and he retired 2 years later." My heart skipped a beat. There was no way that the 30-something woman in front of me had joined the park service in 1973. The unusual uniform, the old-fashioned cruiser and bulky backpack, it was all starting to make sense. What year do you think it is?" "Well, it's 1975. Maddie Corvin stared at me like I was crazy. "Why? What year do you think it is?" Before I could answer, a snapping twig made us both spin. The stag. I had always considered deer to be harmless, innocent animals. I had cried when Bambi's mom died, and hunting had always made me queasy. But there was nothing harmless or innocent about the beast that was staring us down. Foam frothed on its black lips and its eyes glowed with a hateful alien light. It stomped at the ground, and that's when I realized that it was getting ready to charge. "Look out!" Maddie started to yell, but I was already running. The primitive monkey part of my brain wanted to scramble up a tree, but the branches were too high. And meanwhile, the stag's hoofbeats were closing in. A brown blur passed beside me. Maddie Corvin. She was making for a narrow gap between two of the mossy boulders up ahead. She dived into the narrow and jagged space, and I threw myself in after her. Seconds later, antlers cracked against the rock behind me, and then again and again. Ranger Corvin and I had backed as deep into the crevice as we could. The stag's antlers were too wide for it to pass, but it still gnashed at us with its square, herbivore teeth, like it was trying to eat us alive. Blood poured down its forehead, but it kept battering its body against the stone until it finally crumpled to the ground and lay still. Maddie and I looked at each other. She approached and opened one of its tightly closed eyelids with 2 fingers. The eerie light was gone from its eyes. The stag was dead. I asked Maddie if this was normal behavior for the deer around here. She looked at me like she wanted to skewer me on the stag's antlers herself. I could see why she was so frustrated. In our haste to flee the stag, we had completely lost sight of the tape-marked tree. Or so I thought. Even though Maddie had only marked 1 tree, behind us were 6 of them, each indicating that we had come from a different direction. What the hell was going on here? "Okay, so the tape isn't going to work," Maddie said numbly. "What about the rocks? These boulders had to roll down from someplace. We can follow them uphill until we're high enough to see the road." I squeezed the pink jacket in my hand. Kylie loved exploring, loved looking over the edge of high places. Would she also think to follow the big stones uphill? It was slow going. There was no path through these sea of ferns and enormous trees, no indication of direction apart from the trail of boulders. No birds sang, no squirrels leapt from branch to branch. The quiet made me paranoid. I kept looking over my shoulder when I really should have been paying more attention to what was in front of me. I was about to take another step when I felt a weight on my shoe. Something cold and heavy slithered across my foot. I heard a rattle. No, a lot of rattles. The ferns around us were rustling, but not because of any breeze. Maddie Corvin froze and we made eye contact, and she reached slowly for the nearest boulder. I copied her. The feel of the rough stone was reassuring, but would I be able to scramble up it in time? No quick movements, I warned myself. Do not panic. No matter what happens, do not panic. With a shout and a kick, Maddie Corvin sprung onto the rock. Something long and writhing snapped at her as it fell from her leg. She was clinging to the rock by her toes and fingernails, but she made it. Meanwhile, the rattling around me had intensified. My blood turned to ice as the thing on my foot began to coil its way up my bare leg. Its scales were cold against my skin. The tongue of a second snake had flickered against my ankle. "Maddie," I whispered, "get going and find Kylie." The look in Ranger Corvin's eyes as she looked back at me told me that I was a dead man. But she understood that Kylie was my priority. She scrambled up the boulder and out of sight. The serpent coiled around my thigh and squeezed tighter. I held my breath, waiting for its bite, but it never came. The snake, wrapped around my ankle, hissed up at it, and with a hiss of its own, it slithered down my other pant leg and out the cuff of my jeans. It was now or never. I very slowly lifted my boot and planted it on the rock. I would only get one chance at this, and if I fell, I was a dead man. Fangs shot out of the ferns and buried themselves in the sole of my shoe, and that was all the motivation that I needed. I threw myself against the rock face and clawed my way to the top of the boulder. The ground below looked deceptively peaceful from up here, and Ranger Corvin was nowhere to be found. I climbed from stone to stone until the slope of the land grew steeper. Up ahead, a jagged black cave opened in the cliff face like a hungry and toothless maw. Several objects hung from the branches around it, more of those creepy dolls. The gruesome style was the same as before, but the clothes that they were wearing were different. "Where I'm going, there are lots of kids like me," Kylie had said. And did each one of those figurines represent a kidnapped child? I shivered. The breeze from the cave was musty and cold. Whatever was causing the strangeness in this part of the park clearly emanated from here. The dolls were proof enough of that. Did I really think that I stood a chance against something that could vanish at will, control the minds of animals, and send a horde of snakes slithering down the side of a mountain? It didn't matter. My daughter's life was at stake. So much had changed after Kylie was born, and one of the things I left behind was my cigarette habit. I used to smoke about a pack a day, but during my wife's pregnancy, I cut it back to 0. Even so, I never stopped carrying a lighter in my pocket. I couldn't have said why. Maybe I imagined having one last toke in my final moments, like some 80 movies action hero. But instead, that frail piece of plastic was about to be my only source of light as I entered the cave ahead. The sloping stone ceiling grew lower and lower as I walked. I've always been claustrophobic, and soon I was afraid that I would have to crawl in the dirt alongside the hand-sized cave spiders. But the path never grew so narrow. In fact, I couldn't shake the feeling that something just a little bit taller than me had been moving through here for so long that the tunnels had accommodated to its shape. Before long, the daylight and fluttering insects of the surface world were gone. There was nothing but me and my lighter, and I had no idea how much juice it had left. At any moment it might burn out, leaving me in total darkness. The flame reflected off of something up ahead. Dark and rainbow patterns shifted on its surface. reminded me of oily water, but the stuff was too thick for that. Glistening strands of it hung, mucus-like from the ceiling. A tiny figure stood at the edge of the weird pool, looking doubtfully into it. Careless of whatever dangers might have been lurking in the shadows, I threw open my arms and I ran to her. "Kylie!" "Hi, Daddy." My daughter smiled. She didn't seem hurt, not physically at least. I asked her what she was doing here. "Oh, the man in the woods said that I should go for a swim. He says that if I do, I'll be able to fly and talk to animals just like him." What? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How? "Oh, I don't know. Why don't you ask him yourself? He's standing right behind you." At that moment, the flame of my lighter went out. I hugged Kylie to my chest and fled back the way that I had come. I hoped, at least. My foot slipped on a loose rock and I crashed headfirst into something that was cold, slimy, and taller than me. There was an awful, inhuman chittering noise. 6 long fingers grazed my hair as they grabbed for my head. Kylie screamed, and I dragged us forward along the cave floor, ignoring the spiders skittering through my hair and down the back of my shirt. The man in the woods, whatever it was, strode slowly behind us, taking its time, enjoying this. There was a light up ahead, but that didn't make any sense. Even if we had made it further than I thought, we still shouldn't have been anywhere near the cave entrance. The light bobbed closer and shone on our faces. It was a flashlight. Its beam flickered up to the thing hovering over us. "Stay down and keep moving," Maddie Corvin shouted. The boom of her echoed deafeningly from the cave walls, but in the glow of her flashlight, the path to the exit was clear. There was movement behind us, a lot of movement, as though dozens of child-sized things were scurrying across the cobweb ceiling. Maddie kept firing, and Kylie and I kept running. I set my daughter down as soon as we were free of the cavern. To my surprise, I could see the creek and even the cars from where we stood, less than a half a mile away. It was as though whatever disorienting power permeated the place had faded, at least for now. Moments later, Ranger Corvin backed out of the cave, her pistol still aimed into the gloom. "Did you get it?" I whispered. "I don't know," Maddie answered truthfully. "But I'm not budging from this spot until I'm sure you folks are safe. Get back to your wife and get out of here." With Kylie on my shoulders, I staggered back through the ferns. My eyes swept the ground for snakes, but like the 6 tape-marked trees and creepy dolls, the rattlers were suddenly nowhere to be found. At the edge of the creek, I spotted something shiny lying in the mud. My car keys. Heather sat up in the back of Ranger Corvin's cruiser as we approached. "You're back so soon," she called out. "How on earth did you find Kylie so fast?" From Heather's perspective, I had been only gone for a few minutes. For me and Ranger Corvin, however, it felt like half a day had passed. I wondered what Maddie would find when and if she made it out of those woods. My wife's eyes grew wide as she heard 3 gunshots from the ridge above. There was something desperate about the sound that spurred me into action. Ranger Corvin needed help, and we were the only ones who could get it for her. "I told you this was a bad place," Kylie sniffled, wiping at the cave dirt on her face. Heather clipped her into her car seat as I pulled out of the gravel turnoff and raced back down the 2-lane road to a small gas station that I spotted near the entrance of the park. Leaving the engine running, I dashed inside. A dusty bell jingled above the door. The place was a 4-pump store that sold overpriced drinks and firewood to tourists while locals stopped in for bait and coffee. The woman behind the counter dropped a pot of it when she saw me come running in. For Maddie Corvin, almost 50 years had passed, but she had recognized me right away. Her Forest Service uniform had been replaced with a yellow gas station polo shirt, and her hair had gone gray. But her bright green eyes had lost none of their sharpness. I had no doubt that the woman at the cash register was the same person who had saved my daughter and I from certain death only hours before. "You," she grunted in a voice roughened by years of booze and cigarettes. I always wondered if you would ever come walking through that door. After what happened, it's the only reason that I stuck around here." When Maddie had emerged from the woods back in 1975, raving about missing children and missing time, there had been no proof to back up her claims. My family and I were nowhere to be found, and she wasn't able to locate the cave or the grotesque dolls again. The Park Service let her go less than a month later, citing mental health concerns. She had worked here at the gas station ever since, listening to the tales the locals told about odd animal behavior and unexplained sightings at the gravel turnoff by the creek. "I warn the tourists about the place. I tell them that there's a dangerous bear in the area. It's easier than the truth, and who knows, maybe some of them will listen." Out in the car, Kylie was getting antsy, squirming and kicking in her car seat. She had been through so much. I made a point to grab a few of her favorite snacks from the gas station shelves, but when I went to pay, Maddie waved me away. "It's on the house." The ex-ranger smirked. "I don't know how to thank you." "Oh, forget about it. It's ancient history. You really want to thank me? Spread the word. Let people know that if they notice kids or animals acting strange in the woods, it might be the only warning that they get." I promised that I would. She waved as we pulled out of the parking lot, standing just as tall and strong as she had been in the moment that we met. I hoped that whatever was lurking among the tall trees behind the gas station would allow her to live out the rest of her days in peace. I hoped, too, that I wasn't taking a part of it out of the park with me, and Kylie was munching contently on a chocolate donut in the back seat. But when I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her bright green eyes flashed up to meet my own. "Keep driving, Daddy," her voice said inside my head. "Keep driving and act like you don't know."